The story I'm about to tell you is related to this, and it's the story of the ghosts of Flight 401. It's difficult for anyone to deny it or call it a myth because many people witnessed what happened. Not just one or two witnesses, but hundreds. What is the story of Flight 401 that led to the appearance of ghosts on various flights? How did the passengers on this flight transform into ghosts and appear to people? What were these ghosts doing, and what did they look like? Watch the video to the end to learn the story in detail. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you're the first to see new uploads. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York, heard the announcement over the loudspeakers that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was ready to depart. About half an hour later, 176 passengers boarded the plane, including the 13 crew members. The 13 crew members then began their final preparations for takeoff. The aircraft used for this flight was very expensive, and the model was very modern for its time. The cost of manufacturing this aircraft was extremely high, unlike any ordinary plane. The aircraft model was called the Lockheed 1011 TriStar, or L-1011 for short. Technologically, this model was very advanced for its time, and in terms of size, it was incredibly large, capable of accommodating 400 passengers. While ordinary airplanes at that time had 4 seats in a row, the L-1011s had 8 seats in a single row. And that's not all. This aircraft was divided into 2 levels. The first level was the main cabin where the passengers were seated. The second floor below was located at the rear of the aircraft, and you could reach it via 2 elevators. Each elevator was very small, barely accommodating 1 person. These elevators took you down to the galley. The galley was very large and spacious, filled with ovens and refrigerators. Beyond the galley was another room, designed as a lounge, specifically for the crew to use if they wanted to relax. The captain, or pilot-in-chief on this flight, was named Bob Loft, 55 years old, with over 30,000 flying hours. He was known to be an excellent pilot. After Captain Bob boarded the aircraft and made his way to the cockpit, he took the front left seat. In the right-hand seat next to him sat the co-pilot, 10 years his junior, named Bird Stocksell. In regular airplanes, the cockpit had only 2 seats, one for the captain or pilot and one for the first officer. But in the L-1011s, the cockpit was enormous, with 4 seats. That means in addition to the 2 pilot seats, there were also 2 flight attendants. Who sat in them? They were joined by a third person, the flight engineer, Don Rebo, who was 51 years old. A few seconds later, a fourth person, Angel Wanato, 47 years old, arrived. To be honest, Angel didn't have any specific job on the plane other than being an employee of Eastern Airlines. That night, he needed to get to Miami, so the company put him on Flight 401 so he could travel with them. At 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks were completed. All the passengers were in their seats, and the flight crew was fully prepared. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., the plane began its takeoff. Flight 401 was flying over New York City, heading south towards Miami in 2 hours. After that, the flight was perfectly normal, calm, and beautiful. So much so that one of the passengers, Jairus Cabau, took out a pen and paper and wrote a letter praising the airline. He mentioned how happy he was with Eastern Airlines, how easy and pleasant the flight was, and how comfortable he felt. He intended to mail the letter to Eastern Airlines upon arrival in Miami. But at 11:32 a.m., 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, the smooth and beautiful flight would suddenly take an unexpected turn. At that moment, Captain Bob began approaching Miami International Airport. He could see the runway in the distance and started preparing to lower the landing gear. However, a problem arose. When he tried to lower the wheels, not all the indicator lights worked. The aircraft's landing gear consisted of 3 sets, one set under the right wing, one set under the left wing, and the third set at the front of the aircraft below the cockpit. Each of these sets was connected to a green indicator light in the cockpit. If the right landing gear is deployed, the corresponding indicator light will illuminate, as will the left landing gear light and the light for the front landing gear. However, when the captain retracted the wheels, the indicator lights for both the right and left landing gears came on, while the light for the front landing gear remained completely off. This indicated that the front landing gear had not retracted. The captain and his 3 companions then assumed the problem might be with the indicator light only, not the wheels themselves, since the aircraft was new and had been thoroughly inspected before the flight. They reasoned that it was impossible for the front landing gear to malfunction like this. To confirm, the captain retracted the wheels and the indicator lights for both the right and left landing gears went out. He then retracted them again, hoping that all 3 lights would illuminate. The problem persisted. The right and left landing gear lights remained on, while the front landing gear lights remained off. The captain switched on his radio and contacted air traffic control at Miami Airport, informing them of a problem with the landing gear and that he was unable to land. He stated that resolving the issue would take some time. The control tower instructed him to move his plane away from the runway, as flying directly over the airport would disrupt the movement of taking off and landing aircraft. They asked him to fly slightly away from the airport over an area called the Everglades, a large body of water with plants and trees, but the water was shallow and the ground was soft and wet. So the captain headed towards the Everglades, engaged the autopilot, and set it to keep the plane circling at an altitude of 600 meters above the lake, so he could focus on fixing the problem of the nose wheels refusing to deploy. At first, the captain thought the problem was only with the indicator light, so he kept tapping on it with his fingers to make it light up, but it didn't. He then removed the landing gear component from the control panel to check for a broken wire or a stuck gear, but he found nothing. He replaced the component, but the nose wheel was still off. The captain was frustrated because he still couldn't determine whether the problem was with the wheels or the indicator light. He turned around to the flight engineer, Don Rebo, and instructed him to descend through a hole in the cockpit called Hell Hole. Hell Hole leads to a room beneath the cockpit containing the aircraft's systems, equipment, and wiring. It has a tiny peephole like a peephole through which one can see the front of the plane from below and determine if the front landing gear has deployed. The flight engineer descended into the room to investigate the problem with the front landing gear. At this point, we cut outside the aircraft to a different scene, the large lake below. A man named Robert Marquez and his friend were fishing in the lake using an airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottomed boat propelled forward by a large propeller at the rear. This type of boat is common in lakes like these because the water is only about 3 inches deep, less than 10 centimeters, making it unsuitable for boats with submersible engines. It was a very dark night, and the lake was completely dark. There were no buildings, no car lights, no people nearby, and everything was miles away. The only source of light was the headlamps on the boat, which they used to search for frogs. Suddenly, a huge yellow light appeared from the ground about 5 miles away. It flashed on, illuminated a large area of the lake, and then vanished just as quickly. "What happened?" Robert asked his friend. "I don't know," his friend replied. Let's go find out. They quickly started the propeller and headed towards the source of the light. After 15 minutes, traveling at 65 kilometers per hour, they couldn't believe their eyes. 20 minutes back, when Captain Bob turned to the flight engineer and said, "Go down through the heel hole and see if the nose wheels are down," it's likely that as he turned to speak to the engineer, he accidentally bumped his foot against a wheel or control stick. That small bump was enough to disable the autopilot, which had programmed the aircraft for a gradual descent. However, no one in the cockpit noticed the descent because the area above the lake was dark. There was no full moon, no brightly lit buildings nearby, and the captain had no visibility beyond the blackness. Secondly, the descent wasn't sudden, but very gradual and slow. Therefore, the captain didn't realize the aircraft was coming down and believed it was following its programmed, fixed, circular flight path. Third, everyone in the cockpit was busy fixing the lighted nose landing gear, which was off. Not long after the flight engineer descended to the instrument hatch, the captain and his two companions in the cockpit heard a sudden warning that the plane was about to crash. By the time the captain realized what was happening and tried to regain altitude, the plane had already hit the ground with everyone on board. Upon impact, it exploded. This explosion was the flash that Robert Marquez, the frogman, and his companion saw in the lake. When they went by boat to the site of the explosion, they were horrified by the sight of the passengers, victims of the crash. Some were screaming, some were crying, some were screaming in pain, some were dead, and some were taking their last breaths. Fortunately, the ground where the plane crashed was muddy. The explosion and subsequent fire were unable to spread rapidly due to the moisture and water in the soil. Had the plane crashed on solid ground, it would have been completely destroyed and burned. Secondly, the plane was descending gradually, not striking the ground nose first and breaking apart. Therefore, the crash was not as violent as some other plane crashes, which is why some people survived while others perished. Robert Marquez and his colleague tried to help the remaining passengers who were still alive, attempting to extract them from the wreckage. 30 minutes later, civil defense and rescue teams arrived at the scene and continued using helicopters until dawn to transport the injured to hospitals. By sunrise the following day, there were no more survivors. 99 people died in the crash and 77 survived. Among the dead were Captain Bob Loft, his first officer Bird Stokes Steele, and flight engineer Don Ribaugh, who had landed to investigate a problem with the nose landing gear. The fourth employee on board, Angelo Donato, survived the crash, as did the man named Gariscayo, who was writing a letter to the airline describing the flight's beauty and wonder. Following the investigation, it was determined that the crash was caused by human error. The front landing gear was deployed and functioning normally. The real problem was that the landing gear indicator light was burned out and not working. After the investigation, the airline pledged to pay all necessary compensation to the injured and the families of the victims, and promised to completely overhaul its pilot training program to prevent such accidents or disasters from happening again. But this was not the end of Flight 401's story. It was just the beginning. He speaks in a dark, quiet voice, as if he's talking about a scary documentary. 3 years after that incident, hundreds of employees at Eastern Airlines began experiencing a new wave of terrifying phenomena. Many of these employees went to their supervisors to complain about what was happening to them, but the company had warned them not to speak about it. Any employee who spoke about these phenomena or complained to the company was either given sick leave to see a psychiatrist or fired. Despite the intense pressure exerted by the company on employees to remain silent, some courageous employees shared their stories with the press and media. However, these employees did not reveal their identities, so please note that the names mentioned here are pseudonyms. In March 1973, 3 months after the Flight 401 disaster, Eastern Airlines assigned a flight attendant named Jenny to work on Flight 318 from New York to Florida, along with another flight attendant named Denise. Jenny and Denise were close friends, and neither had ever flown on the aircraft that crashed on Flight 401. However, the aircraft they were working on, Flight 318, was the same model as Flight 401, an L-1011. In fact, Flight 318 contained parts that had survived the Flight 401 crash. Investigators had discovered parts in the wreckage that were still usable and could be installed in new aircraft. Since these parts were of the same model, they underwent testing and were found to be safe for reuse. Since manufacturing this model is extremely expensive and the aircraft involved in Flight 401 was still relatively new, using its intact parts on other planes would have saved the company a considerable amount of money. You get the idea. Also, the parts that survived the crash weren't the primary cause of what happened. The main reason was human error on the part of Captain Bob, who failed to professionally handle a problem with the landing gear indicator light. Jenny and Denise, along with other flight attendants, were working in shifts to serve the 200 passengers on the plane. On the first or main deck, 5 flight attendants were taking passenger orders, while the rest of the flight attendants were on the second deck below, in the galley, preparing food and drinks. At one point during their shift, Denise was on the main deck and had taken a very large number of passenger orders. She felt her mind was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of instructions. So she decided to go down to her colleague Jenny to help her with the numerous orders. But the coincidence that happened at that moment was that Denise, while taking the elevator down to Jenny in the kitchen, was taking another elevator up to Denise to see if she needed help. They both got on the elevators at the same time and didn't see each other. When Jenny reached the top, she asked her colleagues about Denise, and they told her that she had left a minute earlier and was heading to the kitchen. 2 minutes later, Jenny decided to leave the main level and take the elevator down to look for Denise. To fully understand what happened, you need to know the layout of the second level below. When you take one of the elevators and open its door, the kitchen is directly in front of you. If you stand in the middle of the kitchen with your back to the elevators, you'll see a large set of ovens side by side on your left and a row of kitchen cabinets with shelves on your right. If you continue straight ahead without left or right, you'll find a wall. This wall separates the kitchen from the living room. To enter this lounge, there is a door at the far right of the kitchen. If you are standing in the kitchen and the door is open, it is impossible to see the lounge from your position. You would have to stick your head in to see it. This lounge contains several chairs and sofas for the hosts to sit on and relax. When Jenny returned and took the elevator again to see Denise downstairs, the first thing she noticed as she opened the elevator door was that the kitchen was completely empty. There weren't any hostesses in there. The lobby door at the far end of the kitchen was closed. As soon as Jenny stepped down, she had a very strong feeling that Denise was in the lobby. So certain was she that she didn't even open the lobby door to see if she was inside, nor did she knock. Confidently, Jenny started heating the food in the ovens while standing in the kitchen, and she began arranging the food on plates to take it up to the passengers. At that moment, she was absolutely certain that Denise would open the lobby door and come out to her. But 2 minutes passed and no one came out of the lobby. Why hasn't Denise come out? Jenny thought to herself. If she's in the lobby, she'd surely hear the commotion Jenny was making in the kitchen, preparing the food and arranging the plates. Then she wondered, could Denise be playing a trick on me? Perhaps she was hiding inside, only wanting to come out when Jenny entered the living room to surprise and frighten her. Jenny stood in the kitchen, terrified and extremely nervous, waiting for Denise to emerge at any moment and startle her. But after several minutes, no one came out of the living room, and no one appeared, for example, from inside the kitchen cupboards to frighten her. She was completely alone in the kitchen. And the longer she was alone, the more terrified she felt that she wasn't alone. She paced around the kitchen, trembling with fear, then went to the living room door to open it. Before she even opened it, her heart was pounding with anxiety. She opened the door and poked her head inside, only to be surprised to find that there was absolutely no one in the living room. But she still felt that she wasn't alone, and she was absolutely certain that someone was with her, but she couldn't see them. She expected Denise to surprise her at any moment, so she walked quickly to the far end of the living room and began looking behind the chairs and sofas, hoping to find Denise hiding. She secretly prayed that Denise would appear at any moment, but there was absolutely no one in the hall. So, Jenny was alone on the second level, yet she had this terrifying feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone was with her. Terrified, she decided to run upstairs as fast as she could. So frightened was she that she pressed her back against the hall wall to ensure no one would come up behind her or surprise her. She walked through the hall, clinging to the wall, her heart pounding, until she reached the kitchen door. She expected to find someone waiting for her there, but when she arrived, the kitchen was just as empty as ever. She reached the elevator and frantically pressed the button, glancing behind her in terror, the terrifying feeling of someone behind her still haunting her. Finally, the elevator arrived, and she quickly stepped inside, closing the door behind her and ascending to the top. When the elevator reached the top, she opened the door and stepped out. At that moment, a flight attendant named Myard was standing with her back to the elevator. When Jenny rushed out of the elevator in a panic, she collided with Myard's back. After Myard recovered from the impact, she looked at Jenny, and it was clear that Jenny looked terrified. Her face was pale and drenched in sweat, as if she had died and then been brought back to life. Myard looked at her and said, "Are you okay? What happened to you?" But Jenny couldn't find the words. "I can't tell you what happened," she said. Myard kept pressing her with questions to find out what had happened, and finally said, "Come with me, Jenny." She led her to an empty space behind the elevators where Jenny saw Denise. Denise, too, was very pale, like money, and she was sweating and shivering. And here's what happened. When Jenny first went upstairs to look for Denise and discovered that Denise wasn't there, she went back down. During those few minutes that Jenny was on the main level, Denise was on the lower level. Denise said that when she went downstairs, she found the kitchen completely empty, but she had a strong feeling that Jenny was still with her downstairs, that she wasn't alone. The same thing happened to her as it happened to Jenny. She opened the lobby door and looked inside for Jenny. When she didn't find her, she panicked, quickly closed the lobby door, ran to the elevator, and went upstairs. At almost the same moment, Jenny was coming down in the other elevator. So the two hostesses never saw each other during those few minutes, and they never met on the lower level. But each of them, as she went downstairs, had a strong feeling that someone else was there with her, that she wasn't alone. This was the first time that two flight attendants had experienced such a terrifying ordeal, but it later turned out that this had happened to other flight attendants on the same lower level, in the kitchen and lounge on the same 318 aircraft. Of course, if anyone complains to the company, they would not believe him, and they would accuse him of damaging the company's reputation and fire him, or accuse him of being crazy. But these weren't the only terrifying incidents on Flight 318. There are other, far more frightening stories. Just a month later, the same Flight 318 was at New York Liberty International Airport in Los Angeles, undergoing pre-flight inspections before its scheduled departure for Miami that morning. After the inspections were completed and the aircraft was deemed safe, passengers were allowed to board. Once everyone was seated, a flight attendant named Sass began counting the passengers. She noticed one extra passenger, but she didn't know who it was. She recounted the passengers until she discovered that the extra passenger was in first class, and, judging by his uniform, he appeared to be an Eastern Airlines pilot. The flight attendant assumed the pilot was on a deadheading assignment, a term used by airlines to describe a situation where a pilot scheduled to fly from a specific airport is not present. In such cases, the airline sends the pilot on a flight to that airport. In the 1970s, airlines didn't bother to inform the crew that another company employee would be on board, as security procedures weren't as stringent as they are now. So the flight attendant assumed the captain was on a delivery flight, but she was still supposed to take his information. The captain sat motionless in his seat like a statue, his hat pulled down slightly over his face, so much so that no one could see his features. The flight attendant approached him and asked, "Are you?" But he didn't respond, didn't turn towards her, and kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Standing beside him, puzzled by his lack of response, the flight attendant asked in a slightly louder voice, "What's your name, sir, so I can take your information?" Still, he remained seated like a statue, showing no reaction to her question. At that moment, another flight attendant named Diane saw her colleague Sass, her face etched with worry, and approached to find out what was happening. Diane saw her colleague speaking to the captain, but he wasn't responding at all. She tried to speak to him as well, but he remained motionless. The two flight attendants exchanged puzzled glances, and then Sass said, "I'll go to the captain himself and tell him. He'll handle it." Sass went to the cockpit and informed Captain George. She then returned with him, and he went out to investigate. At that moment, 6 passengers nearby noticed something was wrong and began looking towards the silent captain. Captain George and the 2 flight attendants stood trying to speak to him, but he didn't respond in any way. Captain George decided to see the face of this mysterious captain hidden beneath his hat, so he knelt beside the seat to get a better look. As soon as he saw his face, he recoiled in shock and exclaimed, "Unbelievable! That's Captain Bob Loft!" Bob Loft was the same captain who died in Flight 401. George knew Bob well before his death and couldn't believe he was seeing him alive on the plane. Before he could say another word, right before the eyes of Captain George, the 2 flight attendants, and the 6 passengers, the silent captain suddenly vanished into thin air. The passengers screamed in terror, and the 2 flight attendants broke down in tears and shock, not knowing what to do. But they knew they were responsible for the flight, so they tried to remain composed and calm the passengers to prevent panic from spreading throughout the plane. Captain George and the flight attendants began searching every inch of the aircraft for the missing captain, as their minds couldn't comprehend that a human being could simply vanish into thin air. They asked the passengers to remain seated for a full hour while the entire crew conducted a thorough search, but they found no trace of him. After a significant delay, Captain George returned to the cockpit and took off for his destination. Captain George and flight attendants Diane and Sass submitted an official report about the incident to the company, but Eastern Airlines did nothing about it. They simply filed it away without any follow-up. But within just 2 weeks, the news had spread among the company's employees, and everyone wanted to see and read the report. But anyone who went to the records department to look for the report was told that no report existed under Captain George's or flight attendants Diane and Sass's names, and that everything circulating was just nonsense and rumors. But George, Diane, and Sass insisted that they had indeed submitted the report and wondered how it could have disappeared from the records so easily. But some of the company's pilots managed to read the report before it vanished and said, "We read everything in it, and what was written was absolutely terrifying." The company tried in every way to hide the strange events and phenomena, but during the next 2 years, many of the company's employees submitted reports about their observations of many frightening phenomena while working on the company's aircraft, especially the L-1011 aircraft, which were used with spare parts from the wreckage of the ill-fated Flight 401. Employees witnessed several similar apparitions, with figures sitting in the same silent, seated positions as the ghost of Captain Bob. One of the company's managers, while performing his routine duties on a parked plane, saw the ghost of the captain vanish from his seat. He quickly fled the aircraft in a panic, and a full search was ordered. However, as with all the previous disappearances, nothing was found. Another terrifying incident involved the catering company responsible for preparing the meals served to passengers on L-101 aircraft. The meals were stored in the galley on the lower deck. While arranging the meals in the galley, one of the employees decided to go into the adjacent lounge for a short break. Upon entering, he found a figure sitting motionless in his seat. According to the employee's description, the man was wearing the company uniform and a pilot's cap, and he bore a striking resemblance to flight engineer Don Rippo, who perished in Flight 401. When the employee tried to speak to him, he found him sitting motionless, silent, and unresponsive. Suddenly, the man vanished into thin air. The news spread among the catering company's employees, and they became terrified of boarding that type of aircraft to deliver meals. Another incident occurred on Flight 318, the aircraft most frequently reported to have experienced terrifying phenomena. On one occasion, a pilot and his co-pilot were in the cockpit when they heard a knocking sound coming from the hellhole, the maintenance room directly below. The pilot got up, opened the door to investigate the source of the noise, and went down with his flashlight to search the entire room, but found nothing. When he returned to the cockpit, just before the door closed beneath his feet, he saw the ghost of flight engineer Don Rippo standing motionless in the room below, staring ahead. Then, suddenly, he vanished. On another flight, just beginning, a female passenger started screaming hysterically. When the flight attendants rushed to her to find out what was wrong, she said that a man had suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the empty seat next to her. When she saw him and screamed, he disappeared again. The woman remained in a state of extreme terror and collapse throughout the flight, to the point that when the plane landed in Arizona, they could only remove her by restraining her with a medical device similar to those used for psychiatric patients in critical condition. But not all incidents had terrifying endings. A unique event occurred that saved many lives. One of the pilots entered the cockpit before dawn to prepare for a new flight, and he was the first to enter. When he entered, He said he saw the ghost of flight engineer Don Rippo inside the cockpit. But this time, the apparition spoke to him, saying, "Be careful, there's a serious problem with the aircraft engine." Then it vanished before his eyes. The captain panicked, but he composed himself and went down to inspect the engine. He found exactly the same problem that the engineer Don Rippo's apparition had pointed out. Finally, in 1974, these terrifying phenomena suddenly ceased, and no one knew why. That year, Eastern Airlines declared that all the talk about strange and terrifying phenomena was mere superstition and had no basis in reality. But what happened in 1974 was that during maintenance, the company removed all the parts that had been taken from the wreckage of Flight 401 and previously installed on L-1011 aircraft. Even though those parts were functioning perfectly and without any defects. The company offered no explanation for their removal, but after they were replaced with new parts, all the terrifying phenomena disappeared completely. And that concludes our stories about the ghosts of Flight 401. If you liked this video, you appreciated my efforts in bringing you this video. Please like and subscribe to the channel to receive all the scary and mysterious clips. Thank you for your time. Eternum.